James Hartford stood in his penthouse office, staring at the marriage contract on his mahogany desk. At 32, he'd built an empire that most men could only dream of, but his grandmother's will had one final condition: marry within 6 months or lose controlling interest in the family company. His assistant had presented him with a list of suitable candidates, society women who jumped at the chance to become Mrs. Hartford. But James had done something unexpected. He'd chosen Sarah Mitchell, a woman whose file showed she'd been rejected by 3 potential grooms in the past year, each one walking away after meeting her. The notes were vague, mentioning only that she was unsuitable and not what was expected. James didn't care about society's opinions. He needed a wife on paper, and Sarah needed financial security for her ailing mother. It was a business arrangement, nothing more. The wedding was scheduled for today, a simple civil ceremony with no guests, no fanfare. James had never seen Sarah in person, only a single photograph that showed her from behind, her head turned away from the camera. His lawyer had assured him all the paperwork was in order, and Sarah had signed the prenuptial agreement without protest. She understood this was a transaction, a marriage of convenience that would benefit them both. James would keep his company, and Sarah would receive a generous monthly allowance plus full medical coverage for her mother. After 2 years, they'd divorce quietly, and she'd walk away with a substantial settlement. It was perfect, clinical, and exactly what James wanted. No messy emotions, no expectations, just a business deal with a beginning and an end already planned. James adjusted his tie and headed down to the courthouse, his mind already moving to the quarterly reports he needed to review. He built his fortune on logic and strategy, not sentiment, and this marriage would be no different. His driver pulled up to the courthouse steps, and James saw a woman in a simple white dress standing alone by the entrance. She wore a veil that covered her face completely, an old-fashioned choice that seemed oddly fitting for this strange arrangement. As he approached, she turned toward him, and though he couldn't see her features, he felt an unexpected flutter of curiosity. Who was Sarah Mitchell, the woman no one wanted, and why had 3 men walked away from a financially advantageous match? In an hour, she'd be his wife, and yet she remained a complete mystery. Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched the small bouquet of white roses she'd bought that morning. She'd almost run away 3 times already, her feet carrying her halfway down the block before fear and desperation pulled her back. This was her last chance to save her mother, who needed a surgery the public hospitals wouldn't perform and Sarah couldn't afford. When James Hartford's lawyer had approached her with the offer, she thought it was a cruel joke. Why would a billionaire want to marry her? The woman whispered about at social gatherings, the one potential suitors fled from after a single meeting. But the lawyer had been serious, and the contract had been real. James Hartford didn't want a real wife, he wanted a legal convenience. For Sarah, it was an answered prayer wrapped in unusual circumstances. She'd insisted on the veil, unable to bear the thought of seeing James's reaction before they were legally bound. At least this way, he'd be her husband before he could run like the others. Sarah had learned to live with the stares and whispers, but each rejection had carved deeper into her heart until she built walls so high, she barely felt anything anymore. Her mother told her she was beautiful, that the right man would see past society's shallow judgments, but Sarah had stopped believing in fairy tales. This arrangement with James was better than any fairy tale anyway. It was honest. He wanted her signature on a marriage certificate, not her heart. She could handle that. What she couldn't handle was another man looking at her face and finding her wanting. Through the veil, she watched James approach. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. His dark skin seemed to glow in the afternoon sun, and even from a distance, she could see the sharp intelligence in his eyes. He was handsome in a way that made Sarah's breath catch, but she quickly reminded herself that his looks didn't matter. This wasn't a real marriage. In 2 years, they'd sign divorce papers and go their separate ways. He'd find someone suitable, someone society approved of, and Sarah would have enough money to start over somewhere far away. She just had to get through the ceremony, through the moment when he'd finally see her face, and hope that the signed papers would be enough to keep him from running. The ceremony was brief, almost mechanical. The judge read the standard vows in a monotone voice, clearly accustomed to rushing through multiple weddings in a single afternoon. James spoke his lines clearly, his voice deep and steady, betraying no emotion. Sarah's voice wavered slightly, but she made it through. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, there was a pause that seemed to stretch for eternity. The veil was still in place. James hadn't asked her to remove it, hadn't even seemed curious. For a moment, Sarah wondered if he planned to leave it that way forever, to keep his wife's face a mystery. But then the judge cleared his throat and said the traditional words, "You may kiss the bride." James turned to face Sarah fully for the first time. His hand reached up slowly, and Sarah felt her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. This was it. This was the moment she'd been dreading. His fingers found the edge of the veil, and he lifted it carefully, revealing her face inch by inch. Sarah kept her eyes closed, unable to watch his reaction, bracing herself for the inevitable disappointment, the flash of regret she'd seen in so many eyes before. But instead of pulling away, James went completely still. Sarah finally opened her eyes and found him staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. His hand had frozen halfway to her face, and his eyes were wide with something that looked almost like shock. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Sarah felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, familiar shame washing over her. Even in a business arrangement, she wasn't what he'd expected. But then James did something that surprised her. He smiled. It wasn't a polite smile or a forced one. It was genuine, reaching his eyes and softening his entire face. "Hello, Sarah," he said quietly, his voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. He leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her cheek, so soft and unexpected that Sarah gasped. When he pulled back, he was still smiling, still looking at her with that strange, wondering expression. The judge coughed again, bringing them back to reality, and James signed the marriage certificate with steady hands. They were married, and Sarah had no idea what had just happened. The car ride to James's penthouse was silent, but it was different from the silence Sarah had expected. She thought it would be awkward and uncomfortable, but instead, it felt charged with something she couldn't name. James sat beside her in the back of the luxury sedan, and she could feel his eyes on her every few minutes, though he looked away whenever she turned toward him. Sarah didn't know what to make of his reaction at the courthouse. He hadn't run. He hadn't looked disappointed or disgusted. If anything, he'd seemed almost pleased, and that made no sense at all. Men didn't look at Sarah that way. They looked through her, past her, or away from her entirely. But James kept looking, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. When they arrived at his penthouse, Sarah was overwhelmed by the sheer luxury of it all. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the city's skyline, and every piece of furniture looked like it belonged in a magazine. James showed her to a guest bedroom that was larger than her entire apartment, with an ensuite bathroom featuring marble floors and a bathtub big enough to swim in. "This is your space," he said, standing in the doorway. "I'm just down the hall. The household staff will be here tomorrow to help you get settled, and my assistant will take you shopping for anything you need." He paused, then added, "Your mother's surgery is scheduled for next week. The best surgeons in the country will be performing it." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. That was why she'd agreed to this. Her mother. Nothing else mattered. But as James turned to leave, Sarah found herself calling out to him. "James, wait." He stopped, looking back at her with those intense eyes. "Why did you freeze when you saw my face? Was it what you expected?" She needed to know, needed to understand the expression she'd seen cross his features. James was quiet for a long moment, then he stepped back into the room. "No," he said honestly. "It wasn't what I expected at all." Sarah's heart sank, but then he continued. "Sarah, I don't know what those other men saw when they looked at you, but whatever it was, they were fools." He left before she could respond, closing the door gently behind him. Sarah stood in the middle of her new bedroom, more confused than ever, holding on to those words like a lifeline. Sarah woke up the next morning in silk sheets, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Sunlight streamed through the massive windows, and for a moment, she wondered if the entire previous day had been a dream. But the wedding ring on her finger proved it was real. She was married to James Hartford, a man she barely knew, living in a penthouse that felt more like a museum than a home. A soft knock on the door made her jump. "Come in," she called, expecting a staff member. Instead, James entered carrying a breakfast tray. He was dressed casually in dark jeans and a fitted shirt that showed off his athletic build. "I thought you might be hungry," he said, setting the tray on the desk. "I wasn't sure what you liked, so I made a bit of everything." Sarah stared at him in surprise. "You cooked?" James laughed, and the sound was warm and genuine. "Don't look so shocked. I lived on my own for years before I could afford staff. I can manage scrambled eggs and toast." He sat down in the chair across from the bed, watching as Sarah picked up a piece of toast. "I thought we should talk about the arrangement," he said, his voice becoming more serious. "I know what the contract says, but I think we should set some ground rules for living together. This penthouse is big enough that we can avoid each other completely if that's what you want, but I'd prefer if we could at least be friendly. Civil." Sarah nodded, still processing the fact that her billionaire husband had made her breakfast. "I can do friendly," she said quietly. They spent the next hour talking, and Sarah found herself relaxing in James's presence. He was easier to talk to than she'd expected, asking about her interests, her mother's condition, what she wanted to do with her time now that she didn't have to work 3 jobs to make ends meet. He didn't ask about her past rejections or why other men had walked away. Instead, he told her about his company, his late grandmother who'd raised him, and his love for old jazz music. By the time he stood to leave for work, Sarah felt like she'd glimpsed the real man behind the billionaire facade. "I'll be home around 7, he said at the door. "Maybe we could have dinner together? If you want." Sarah found herself nodding. "I'd like that." After he left, she touched her cheek where he'd kissed her at the courthouse, wondering if this strange arrangement might become something more than either of them had planned. The days fell into an unexpected rhythm. James went to work each morning but always made time for breakfast with Sarah. They'd talk about everything and nothing, and Sarah found herself looking forward to those morning conversations more than she wanted to admit. He'd arranged for his driver to take her to visit her mother at the hospital, and seeing her mother's relief and hope had made every uncomfortable moment of this arrangement worth it. Her mother had cried when she met James, thanking him over and over until he gently told her that family took care of family. The word had made Sarah's heart skip. They weren't really family, but James said it like he meant it. In the evenings, they'd have dinner together, sometimes ordering in, sometimes cooking together in the massive kitchen. James was different from any man Sarah had ever known. He listened when she spoke, remembered small details she'd mentioned days ago, and never once made her feel like she was less than him despite the vast difference in their bank accounts. He asked her opinion on business decisions, genuinely interested in her perspective even though she had no formal education in finance. Sarah found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't with anyone except her mother. She told him about her love of painting, something she'd given up when money became too tight to afford supplies. The next day, an entire art studio appeared in one of the spare rooms, filled with canvases, paints, and brushes of every kind. But despite their growing friendship, they maintained careful boundaries. James never asked to come into her room, never suggested making the marriage real in any physical sense. Sarah told herself she was grateful for his respect, but late at night, she'd lie awake remembering the way he'd looked at her when he lifted her veil, the way his eyes seemed to follow her when he thought she wasn't looking. Sometimes she'd catch him staring at her with that same frozen expression from their wedding day, like he was seeing something that captivated and confused him in equal measure. Sarah wanted to ask what he saw when he looked at her, but she was afraid of the answer. Afraid that this fragile friendship they were building might shatter if they acknowledged the strange tension growing between them. 3 weeks into their marriage, James came home early to find Sarah painting in her new studio. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear him approach, and he stood in the doorway watching her for several minutes. She'd pulled her hair up into a messy bun, and there was a smudge of blue paint on her cheek. James felt something tighten in his chest, a feeling he'd been trying to ignore since the moment he'd lifted her veil. Sarah was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional standards. Her skin was rich and flawless, her eyes expressive and intelligent, her smile genuine when she let herself relax. But it was more than that. There was a light in her when she painted, a joy that made her absolutely radiant. How had anyone looked at her and found her wanting? "That's incredible," he said, finally announcing his presence. Sarah jumped, nearly dropping her brush. "James! I didn't hear you come in." She tried to hide the canvas, but he'd already seen it. It was a painting of the city skyline at sunset, but she'd added something magical to it, little glowing lights that made it look like the buildings were full of fireflies. "You're really talented," he said, moving closer. "Thank you for using the studio." Sarah's cheeks flushed with pleasure. "Thank you for giving it to me. I'd forgotten how much I loved this." They stood there together, the air between them charged with something neither wanted to name. James found himself moving closer, drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain. Sarah's breath caught as James reached out and gently wiped the paint from her cheek with his thumb. The touch was electric, sending shivers down her spine. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice rough in a way she'd never heard before. "I need to tell you something." But before he could continue, his phone rang loudly, shattering the moment. He pulled it out with visible frustration, glancing at the screen. "I'm sorry, I have to take this. It's about your mother's surgery tomorrow." Sarah nodded, stepping back and putting safe distance between them. James walked out, talking in low tones, and Sarah pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart racing. Something was changing between them, something the contract hadn't accounted for. She didn't know if that terrified her or thrilled her, but she couldn't deny it anymore. Sarah's mother's surgery was a success. James had insisted on being there with Sarah, holding her hand in the waiting room for the 8 hours it took. He'd canceled meetings, ignored urgent calls, and stayed by her side through every anxious moment. When the surgeon finally came out with good news, Sarah had collapsed against James's chest, sobbing with relief. He'd wrapped his arms around her, holding her close and whispering reassurances. In that moment, nothing felt fake or contractual. It felt real. It felt like he actually cared about her, not just as a convenient wife but as a person he valued. Sarah let herself lean on him, let herself believe, just for a moment, that this could be more than a business arrangement. They visited her mother in recovery together, and Sarah's mother had smiled at them with tears in her eyes. "You two look so good together," she'd said weakly. "I can see how much he cares for you, baby girl." Sarah had glanced at James, expecting him to look uncomfortable at the misunderstanding, but instead, he'd squeezed Sarah's hand and smiled. "Your daughter is easy to care about," he'd said simply. After they left the hospital, James suggested they take a walk through the nearby park instead of heading straight home. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Thank you for today," Sarah said finally. "You didn't have to stay with me." James stopped walking and turned to face her. "Sarah, I'm starting to realize that a lot of things in our arrangement are changing. Things I didn't expect." He ran a hand over his head, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "When I married you, I thought it would be simple. A business deal. But it's not simple anymore, and I don't know what to do about that." Sarah's heart was pounding. "What are you saying?" James looked at her with those intense eyes that seemed to see right through her. "I'm saying that I look forward to coming home every day because you're there. I'm saying that watching you paint makes me happier than closing any business deal. I'm saying that this doesn't feel like pretend anymore." He took a step closer. "Does it feel like pretend to you?" Sarah couldn't find words. She shook her head slowly, and James exhaled like he'd been holding his breath. "I don't know what those other men saw when they met you, Sarah, but I need you to understand something. From the moment I saw your face, I was lost. You're beautiful. Not in spite of anything, not with qualifications. Just beautiful. And every day since then, I've been falling for you more." Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks. "But you married me because you had to, because of your grandmother's will." James reached up and gently wiped her tears away. "I married you because I needed a wife on paper. But I'm falling in love with you because of who you are. Those are two completely different things. The question is, could you ever feel the same way about me?" Sarah's world tilted on its axis. For weeks, she'd been telling herself this was temporary, that she shouldn't get attached, that James was just being kind because it was in his nature. But now he stood before her, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen him, asking if she could love him. The truth was, she already did. She'd started falling for him during those morning breakfasts, during quiet dinners and shared laughter. She'd fallen for the way he treated her mother with gentle respect, the way he created a space for her to paint, the way he looked at her like she was the most fascinating person in the world. But fear held her tongue. "James, you don't understand. Those men who rejected me, they had their reasons." James shook his head firmly. "I don't care about their reasons. Whatever they were wrong." But Sarah needed him to know, needed him to understand what he was saying he felt. "I have a birthmark," she said quietly. "It covers part of my face, my neck. When I was younger, I learned to use makeup to cover it, and that's what I did for those arranged meetings. But on the wedding day, after they'd signed the contracts, after everything was legal, I'd remove the makeup. I wanted them to know what they were getting." Every single one of them looked at me with disgust and tried to find a way out of the marriage. They paid fees, broke contracts, anything to not be married to me. Tears streamed down her face. "My birthmark is faded now, much lighter than it used to be, but it's still there. And I need you to understand that before you say things you might not mean." James was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah felt her heart breaking. But then he spoke, his voice steady and sure. "Sarah, look at me." She raised her eyes to his. "I saw your birthmark the moment I lifted your veil. I froze not because I was disappointed, but because I was stunned by how beautiful you are. Your birthmark doesn't make you less beautiful. It makes you uniquely you. And those men were cowards who didn't deserve you anyway." He cupped her face gently in his hands. "I meant every word I said. I'm falling in love with you. Not with some perfect image, but with you. The real you. The woman who paints magic into ordinary things, who talks to her mother with such love, who's kind to my staff even though she doesn't have to be. That's who I'm falling for." Sarah couldn't hold back anymore. She reached up and pulled James down, kissing him with all the emotion she'd been holding inside. He responded immediately, his arms wrapping around her and pulling her close. It was nothing like the chaste kiss on their wedding day. This was real, passionate, full of all the feelings they'd been dancing around for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. "Is that a yes?" he asked, a smile in his voice. Sarah laughed through her tears. "Yes. Yes, I could love you. I think I already do." James kissed her again, gentler this time, and Sarah felt like she was in a dream. The man no one thought would want her was holding her like she was precious, looking at her like she was everything. Maybe fairy tales could come true after all. Everything changed after that night in the park. James and Sarah stopped pretending their marriage was just business. He moved his things into her room, or rather, they moved together into the master bedroom, laughing as they negotiated closet space and which side of the bed each preferred. Their relationship deepened in ways Sarah had never imagined possible. James was attentive and affectionate, always finding excuses to touch her, hold her hand, pull her into his arms. He'd kiss her goodbye in the mornings and hello in the evenings, and Sarah felt like she was glowing from the inside out. Her mother had been moved to a private recovery facility, and when they visited together, she'd tearfully told Sarah that she'd prayed for this, for Sarah to find someone who truly saw her. But Sarah's happiness was tinged with an underlying fear she couldn't quite shake. She'd been rejected so many times that a part of her kept waiting for James to change his mind, to wake up one day and realize he'd made a mistake. She tried to hide these doubts, but James knew her too well now. One night, as they lay in bed together, he turned to her with concern in his eyes. "What's wrong? You've been quiet all evening." Sarah wanted to lie, to tell him everything was fine, but she'd promised herself she'd be honest with him. "I keep waiting for you to regret this," she admitted quietly. "To regret us. I know it's not fair to you, but I can't help it." James pulled her closer, his arms strong and reassuring around her. "Sarah, listen to me. I don't make decisions lightly, especially not about my heart. When I told you I was falling in love with you, I meant it. I still mean it. Every day, I fall a little more." He tilted her chin up so she had to look at him. "I know you've been hurt before, and I can't erase that pain. But I can show you, every single day, that I'm not going anywhere. That you're not just wanted, you're cherished. Let me prove it to you." Sarah felt tears welling up again, but these were good tears, healing tears. "I love you," she whispered. "I'm scared to, but I do." James kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "Then be scared with me," he said. "We'll figure it out together." For the first time in her life, Sarah felt truly safe in someone's arms. Months passed, and their love only grew stronger. James began bringing Sarah to business dinners and company events, proudly introducing her as his wife. Sarah had been nervous at first, worried about the stares and whispers she'd endured at social gatherings in the past. But with James by her side, his hand always in hers, his love evident in every glance, she felt invincible. There were still people who stared, society matrons who gossiped behind their hands, but James shut down any negativity with a fierce protectiveness that made Sarah's heart soar. "That's my wife you're talking about," he'd say coldly to anyone who dared say something unkind. "And she's remarkable. If you can't see that, that's your loss, not hers." Sarah's confidence grew. She started painting more, creating pieces that James insisted on displaying throughout their home. He'd invite friends over just to show off her work, beaming with pride as people praised her talent. One of his business associates, who happened to own an art gallery, asked if Sarah would be interested in showing her work publicly. Sarah had been terrified at the idea, but James encouraged her, believing in her even when she didn't believe in herself. Her first exhibition was a small one, just a dozen paintings, but it sold out within days. James had bought the first painting, of course, but he hadn't bought the others. People genuinely wanted her art. It was validation Sarah hadn't known she needed. On their 6-month wedding anniversary, James took Sarah to the courthouse where they'd gotten married. "I want to do something," he said as they stood on the steps. "Our first wedding was a business transaction. I want to give you a real one." Sarah stared at him in shock as he got down on one knee right there in public, pulling out a ring box. "Sarah Mitchell Hartford, you are the most incredible woman I've ever known. You make every day brighter, every moment more meaningful. Will you marry me again? For real this time, with our friends and family, with vows we mean from the bottom of our hearts." Sarah was crying and laughing at the same time. "Yes. Yes, of course yes." James slipped a beautiful ring onto her finger, next to the simple band he'd given her at their first wedding. People walking by stopped to applaud, and James kissed her thoroughly, not caring who was watching. Planning a second wedding was surreal and wonderful. This time, Sarah had a say in everything, and she chose a small ceremony in a garden, surrounded by the people they loved. Her mother, now fully recovered and healthy, cried happy tears through the entire planning process. James's business partner and best friend, Marcus, had become Sarah's friend too, and he'd offered to walk her down the aisle since her father had passed years ago. The wedding was everything their first one hadn't been, full of love, joy, and genuine celebration. Sarah wore a beautiful gown, and this time, no veil. She wanted James to see her face from the moment she started walking toward him. When James saw her coming down the aisle, his eyes filled with tears. Sarah had never seen him cry before, and it made her own tears flow freely. They'd written their own vows this time, and when it was James's turn to speak, his voice was thick with emotion. "Sarah, the day I married you the first time, I thought I was making a practical decision. But the moment I saw your face, I knew I'd been given something precious, something I didn't deserve but would spend my life being worthy of. You've taught me what it means to truly love someone, to see them for who they really are and love them even more for it. You are my heart, my home, my everything. I promise to love you, honor you, and remind you every single day how extraordinary you are." Sarah could barely get through her own vows, she was crying so hard. "James, you saw me when no one else would. You loved me when I didn't even love myself. You took what was supposed to be a business arrangement and turned it into the greatest love story I could have imagined. You are my miracle, my answered prayer, my forever. I promise to love you with everything I have, for all the days of my life." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife for the second time, James kissed Sarah like it was the first time all over again. Their small audience erupted in cheers, and Sarah felt happiness so complete, so overwhelming, that she thought her heart might burst from it. This was what love was supposed to feel like. This was what it meant to be truly wanted. Life settled into a beautiful new normal. Sarah's art career took off in ways she'd never dreamed possible. She had 3 more exhibitions, each one more successful than the last, and was commissioned to create pieces for collectors who'd seen her work. The money she made was her own, something she'd earned through her talent, and it gave her a sense of accomplishment that was different from anything else. James never failed to attend every exhibition opening, standing in the corner with a proud smile, watching people admire his wife's work. He joked that he was her biggest fan, but Sarah knew it was true. He kept every article written about her, every review, and had created a whole room in their home dedicated to pieces she'd made just for him. Their relationship deepened in ways that went beyond romance. They were true partners, supporting each other's dreams and working through problems together. When James faced a difficult business decision that kept him up at night, Sarah sat with him, offering perspective and asking questions that helped him think things through. When Sarah struggled with artistic blocks or self-doubt, James would take her away for weekends, finding new places to inspire her. They traveled together, discovering the world hand in hand, making memories that made their bond even stronger. Every night, they'd fall asleep wrapped in each other's arms, and every morning, James would wake her with a kiss and tell her she was beautiful. But the greatest surprise came on a regular Tuesday morning. Sarah had been feeling tired and nauseous for weeks, assuming it was stress from preparing for her biggest exhibition yet. When the symptoms didn't go away, James had insisted she see a doctor. They'd gone together, sitting in the examination room holding hands, expecting to hear she needed vitamins or rest. Instead, the doctor smiled and said, "Congratulations, you're pregnant." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, and James sat frozen, exactly like he had when he'd first seen her face on their wedding day. Then he turned to her with tears streaming down his face and pulled her into his arms. "We're having a baby," he whispered in awe. "Sarah, we're having a baby." The pregnancy brought new dimensions to their love. James was attentive before, but now he was almost comically protective. He'd researched everything about pregnancy, buying books and attending every doctor's appointment with pages of questions. He'd rearranged his work schedule to be home more, wanting to be present for every moment. He talked to Sarah's growing belly, telling their baby stories about his day, about how amazing their mother was, about all the things they do together as a family. Sarah would lie there, running her fingers through James's hair as he rested his head on her stomach, and feel so overwhelmed with love that she'd have to remind herself this was real, that this was her life now. Sarah's mother was overjoyed at the news of becoming a grandmother. She'd visit often, bringing baby clothes she'd knitted and stories about Sarah as a child. James's best friend Marcus had joked that he was calling dibs on being the godfather, and the warmth of their growing family brought Sarah a peace she'd never known existed. She continued painting, creating a series of pieces inspired by impending motherhood, capturing the emotions and changes she was experiencing. The collection was raw, honest, and beautiful, and when it showed, critics called it her best work yet. James had bought every single piece, refusing to let any of them go. "These are our story," he'd said firmly. "They stay with us." One evening, in her 7th month, Sarah stood in front of the mirror, looking at her changing body. The birthmark on her face and neck seemed even more visible with her pregnancy glow, and for a moment, old insecurities crept in. James came up behind her, wrapping his arms carefully around her expanded middle and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. Sarah hesitated, then admitted, "I was thinking about how much my body has changed. How visible my birthmark seems." And I was wondering if our baby will have one too, and if they do, how do I teach them to love themselves when I spent so much of my life hating this part of me? James turned her gently to face him, his eyes serious and full of love. You teach them by showing them how I love every part of you, James said firmly. By showing them how you've learned to love yourself. And if our child has a birthmark, they'll grow up knowing it makes them special, not different. They'll grow up seeing their mother as the most beautiful woman in the world because that's what their father tells them every day. He pressed a kiss to her birthmark, then to her lips. You are perfect, Sarah. Not despite your birthmark or your past, but because of everything you've overcome, everything you are. And our child will be perfect too, however they look, because they'll be ours. Sarah cried happy tears, and James held her, their baby moving between them, and Sarah realized she'd finally, truly healed from all those old wounds. The baby arrived on a sunny morning in spring. Sarah had been painting in her studio, insisting she felt fine despite being 2 days past her due date, when her water broke all over the canvas she'd been working on. James had been in a meeting, but he left immediately, probably breaking several traffic laws on the way to get her to the hospital. Labor was long and difficult, and James never left her side, holding her hand and coaching her through each contraction. When their daughter finally arrived, small and perfect with her father's eyes and her mother's beautiful skin, both parents cried. James cut the umbilical cord with shaking hands, and when the nurse placed their daughter in Sarah's arms, he wrapped them both in his embrace, his family, his whole world. They named her Grace, because she was a gift of grace neither of them had expected but both treasured beyond measure. Grace was a healthy, happy baby who seemed to know from the start that she was deeply loved. James was a natural father, patient and gentle, getting up for night feedings without complaint and spending hours just watching their daughter sleep. Sarah would often wake to find him standing by Grace's crib, tears on his face, overwhelmed by the love he felt. I never knew I could love anyone this much, he told Sarah one night. Except I already felt that way about you, so I guess my heart just keeps expanding. Sarah kissed him, understanding completely. Love didn't divide between parent and child, it multiplied, grew, became infinite. As Grace grew, it became clear she had her mother's artistic spirit. Even as a toddler, she'd sit with Sarah in the studio, covering herself in paint and creating abstract masterpieces on paper. James would come home from work to find both his girls covered in colors, laughing together, and he'd pull out his phone to capture the moment. Their home was filled with Grace's artwork alongside Sarah's, and James treated their daughter's scribbles with the same reverence he showed Sarah's paintings. He'd frame them and hang them in his office, proudly showing them to business associates who'd smile indulgently. Grace was growing up surrounded by love, never knowing what it meant to feel unwanted or unworthy. When Grace was 2, something happened that brought Sarah's past back into sharp focus. They were at a park, and another mother approached Sarah, recognition dawning on her face. Sarah? Sarah Mitchell? I don't know if you remember me, but we were at the same social circle years ago. I heard about your arranged marriage meetings. Sarah tensed, instinctively pulling Grace closer. But the woman's face was kind, not judgmental. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. We all were so shallow back then, so caught up in appearances. But I've seen your art exhibitions, seen pictures of you and your husband and daughter. You look so happy. And I realized that all those men who rejected you missed out on something incredible. The woman smiled sadly. Sometimes the people who judge us the harshest are the ones who end up regretting it most. Sarah was gracious, thanking the woman for her words, but after she left, Sarah sat on the park bench feeling the weight of old memories. James had taught her to see herself differently, but hearing acknowledgement from someone who'd been part of that judgmental world meant something too. It was closure, in a way. James found her there, having chased Grace to the swings, and sat beside her. "You okay?" he asked, always attuned to her moods. Sarah nodded, watching their daughter laugh as she swung higher. "I was just thinking about how different my life could have been. If you hadn't chosen me for that arrangement. If you'd run like the others." James took her hand, linking their fingers together. "But I didn't run. I stayed. And I'd make the same choice 1,000 times over, Sarah. You're the best decision I ever made." Years passed in a blur of happiness. Grace grew into a bright, confident child who inherited her mother's artistic talent and her father's business mind. She was curious about everything, asking endless questions that James patiently answered while Sarah sketched them together. Their home was warm and full of laughter, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile penthouse it had been when Sarah first arrived. She'd transformed it into a real home, filling it with color, life, and love. James's company continued to thrive, but he'd learned to balance work and family, never missing important moments in Grace's life. He coached her soccer team, attended every school play, and had tea parties with stuffed animals without a hint of embarrassment. Sarah's art career had reached new heights. She was now considered one of the most promising contemporary artists of her generation, with galleries around the world showcasing her work. But she never let success change her. She taught art classes to underprivileged children twice a week, wanting to give others the opportunity to express themselves that she'd almost lost. James would sometimes join her, helping kids who struggled with business concepts, and together they made a difference in their community. Grace would come along sometimes, acting as a helper despite being young herself, already showing the compassion her parents had instilled in her. One evening, as they celebrated their 5th wedding anniversary, their real one, not the courthouse one they joked about, Sarah looked around the table at her family. Her mother was there, healthy and vibrant, laughing at one of James's stories. Marcus was there with his own family, their children playing with Grace. Friends they'd made over the years filled their home with warmth and joy. Sarah felt James's hand find hers under the table, giving it a gentle squeeze. She looked at him, this man who'd seen her when no one else would, who'd loved her when she couldn't love herself, who'd given her a life beyond her wildest dreams. "Thank you," she whispered. James leaned over and kissed her temple. "For what?" Sarah smiled, tears of happiness in her eyes. "For freezing instead of running. For seeing me. For loving me." James's own eyes grew misty. "Thank you for letting me." Life had a way of coming full circle. Sarah received an invitation to speak at a women's empowerment event, sharing her story of overcoming rejection and finding self-worth. She was hesitant at first, not wanting to dredge up painful memories, but James encouraged her. "Your story could help someone who's struggling right now," he said gently. "Someone who feels unwanted, who thinks they're not enough. You could show them there's hope." So Sarah agreed, and on the day of the event, James sat in the front row with Grace on his lap, both wearing shirts that said Sarah's biggest fans. Sarah laughed when she saw them, feeling her nervousness ease. She told her story honestly, holding nothing back. She talked about the rejections, the shame, the feeling of being fundamentally unworthy of love. She showed pictures of her younger self, pointing out the birthmarks she tried so hard to hide. Then she showed recent pictures, her wedding photos, images of her family, her art, her life now. "I thought I needed to be perfect to be loved," she said, her voice strong and clear. "I thought my birthmark made me unlovable. But the truth is, the right person doesn't need you to be perfect. They just need you to be you. Real, honest, imperfect you. And when you find that person, or when you learn to be that person for yourself, everything changes. The audience gave her a standing ovation, and several women approached her afterward with tears in their eyes, thanking her for giving them hope. That night, after Grace was asleep, Sarah and James lay in bed together, and Sarah told him how powerful it had felt to share her story. "I never thought I'd be able to talk about those rejections without feeling shame," she admitted. "But today, I felt proud. Proud of how far I've come, proud of what we've built together." James pulled her closer, kissing her forehead. "I'm proud of you every single day. Not just for what you've overcome, but for who you are. You're the strongest person I know, Sarah." She snuggled into his chest, listening to his heartbeat, and realized that the little girl who'd felt unwanted, the young woman who'd been rejected, was finally at peace. She was loved, not despite her perceived flaws, but completely, wholly, without reservation. On what would have been their 10th anniversary of the courthouse wedding, they now celebrated 2 anniversaries every year, which James joked was twice the gifts he had to buy. Sarah had a surprise for James. She'd been working on something secret for months, sneaking time in her studio when he was at work or Grace was at school. That morning, she led him to the studio with his eyes covered, barely able to contain her excitement. When she finally let him look, James stood completely still, exactly like he had on their wedding day when he'd first seen her face. Before him was her masterpiece, a massive painting that told their entire story. The painting was divided into scenes, each flowing into the next. It started with a small figure of Sarah, hunched and hidden, covered in shadows. Then James appeared, reaching out his hand, and light began to break through. The next scene showed their courthouse wedding, Sarah still veiled, James frozen in that moment of revelation. Then there was the park where they'd first kissed, their second wedding in the garden, Grace being born, family dinners, quiet moments, and finally, the 3 of them together, radiating light and color and life. But what made James's breath catch was the detail. Sarah had painted her birthmark prominently in every scene, not hidden or minimized, but celebrated as part of the beauty, part of the story, part of what made her uniquely her. "Do you like it?" Sarah asked nervously as James continued to stare in silence. Finally, he turned to her, tears streaming down his face. "Sarah, this is... I don't have words. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. It's us. It's our love story." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "I froze when I saw your face because I'd never seen anyone more beautiful. I'm freezing now for the same reason, because you've taken our story and made it into something so beautiful it takes my breath away." They stood there together, looking at the painting that showed how far they'd come, how love had transformed them both. Grace found them like that later, and without needing to be told, she understood. This was their family's story, painted in colors that would never fade, a reminder that being unwanted by some made being truly wanted by the right person all the more precious. And as Sarah stood between her husband and daughter, both holding her hands, she knew that this was the ending she'd stopped believing was possible, a true happily ever after.